I'm Michael Kelleher, Director of the Windham-Campbell Prizes at Yale University. Welcome to the 2021 Windham-Campbell Prizes Virtual Festival. We'll be streaming a new episode each week for the next 9 Wednesdays. Each episode will focus on one of this year's prize recipients, and the final episode will be a keynote address by U.S. Poet Laureate Joy Harjo. While the episodes stream, you'll be able to chat with other audience members, and following the live stream, we invite you to join the writer in a live Zoom Q&A. In the week between each episode, there will be plenty of on-demand content available for you to enjoy. Today's episode features Renee Gladman, fiction writer, essayist, poet, publisher, and visual artist. She's the author of Event Factory, Anna Petova Crosses a Bridge, the essay collection Calamities, and most recently, One Long Black Sentence, a collection of visual work indexed by the poet Fred Moten. What you are about to see is Renee and DJ and sound artist Val Jeanty in a multidisciplinary improvisation using music, drawing, and words.
So I have this dream, this relationship with music sound, that if I work with sound, I can get places that language won't allow me to reach, or that I can't reach through writing. I had this vision, fantasy that if I could do these things, like draw these scores, which I have been doing for a while, and give them to a composer or a sound artist, that they would be able to, through a kind of like generosity in their own imagination, create a sound space that responded to the score. And that would be, that would sort of show me the space that's beyond the boundary of what's legible or what is writing, and kind of explore the space that I've been thinking about as non-knowing or non-visibility. So when I was approached with this opportunity to collaborate with Val Jeanty, I was excited to figure out how we could work on this idea together. The thing that's most exciting to me right now is that it's creating a thinking space. So she's improvising with the text that I pre-recorded, which is an essay that I wrote where I'm trying to think about definitions of space within a kind of architectural venue. So I'm working with a sculptor's work who makes a lot of kind of architectural spaces using shadow and corridors and et cetera. So I was trying to sort of write into those spaces, and then I gave her the text and asked her to just sort of do whatever she wanted to do with them. And so what we are about to do, what we've done, is she's manipulating that text, creating sound with it, and then I am sort of tapping into that space where sound creates these kind of portals, and I'm drawing through those openings. And that's what this performance is. I think of it as we're improvising. It feels like a laboratory where we're working together, kind of workshop. So maybe not as much a performance as a kind of live thinking space. I realized finally that when I was looking at space, I realized finally that when I was looking at space. can't, can't space. Space was there because something inside of it was flowing. In fact, space was something cut to something cut. Cut to something flowing. It was something cut. It was something extending from something cut and something hanging. It was something cut and 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 cut. It was something cut, interrupted by something flowing and something radiant and fast, slanting across something hollow. Space was something hollow, something hollow. Hollow, 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 made from something cut, and it was radiant, and it was long. Space was long and dark, and it was radiant, and it was cut. It was cut, 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 cut. Cut, 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 cut. Large and unknown. It was tiny and radiant. It was radiant and dark. As I stood, I saw something slanting through something cut and something extending into something clearing. And the clearing was full of cuts, and inside the cuts was something full that was also hollow. And inside the cuts was something full that was also hollow. It was something radiant leaning on something cut. It was something utterly radiant, shaped by something cut. Shaped. Shape, 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 shaped by something cut against something hollow inside something crowded with objects that themselves were cuts. Space was something cut to something seen but unseen, something spreading and shaping without itself shaping. As I stood, I saw something slanting. While I was looking, I counted something malleable and hanging. I counted something inelastic and square. I walked a little further and counted something malleable, cut by something flowing, and edged by something dark. Something dark was vying by something cut to form the edge of something cut. The edge, edge. The edge. malleable, and it was space that made this radiant. It also was space that showed how something malleable could be both something hanging and something elapsing. It could be something passing as well as something passed through. It could be malleable and cut, and therefore could fold where it was elapsing. In that moment, space was something passing, cut through something. Cut through something holding. And it was not the same as being something flowing, cut through something hanging, or something radiant speeding across something framed, something framing the radiantly empty dark, all that silent speed. Dark, all that silent speed. Empty dark, all that silent speed. Silent, 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 silent speed. Speed, 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 speed. Space was something cut, but it was also something passing, an elapsing of something going, and a filling in of something dark. It was a heaping of objects cut to something flowing, and it was dark inside where it was radiant and was fast when passing through its own frame. Space, I saw, as it was cut, was also teeming. It had filled up with objects. It was something holding to something broken into parts. Something broken into parts. Something broken to something flowing. The objects were broken and not yet made, or made too far, and were dark and radiant. Space was the radiance of objects in a kind of strained in action. It formed an edge between something doing and something done, elapsing the moment it became permanent. Space was a hollow of bright edges. It was something hollow cut into something teeming. It was a building in of hollows. It made a clearing that was also elapsing. And this led to my seeing how something extended could become something passing. Space was something still that was also moving and could be radiant and dark at once. Space was something physical cut to something elapsing, and this materialized as something hanging. Space was something hanging that was both radiant and elapsing, something empty, something folded. I counted something folded. I counted something sprawled. I counted something inelastic. There was a long pause. It was space, 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 space. Space. Then I counted something malleable. I counted something elegantly inelastic. Then there was a bridge of darkness flowing. I counted something malleable and hanging. I counted three framing, cutting clearings that were empty. I counted something flat and something tall with a clearing. Space was above me. I hadn't quite known. I counted a long and very narrow cut through something impermeable and something impermeable holding up something hollow. The whole thing was hollow until it was cut by something hanging, even though the hanging itself was hollow. Space was a series of hollows interrupted by something inelastic, something fast, darkening, something flat, something unknown and malleable. Space was something draping that enclosed its own radiance. It was something radiant cut to something glowing of a different tone, something deeper cut to the dark hollow, something orange. In this one moment, space was something orange cut through something malleable and hanging. It gave off a feeling. Space gave off a feeling that it itself was feeling something. The desire of cutting and being cut. The ambition of flowing. The awe of elapsing. Space was something holding, feeling, something elapsing, and something dark, and it glowed, and it showed itself as that in a long and narrow way, in an open and clear way, in a vertically disappearing way. Eventually, I arrived at an intersection of my seeing, where I was looking out at space at the same time that I was making space by my looking. And I was being pulled into space by having a relationship to what was cut, what was flowing, such that I was also cut and flowing. I was something cut inside something cut, and was a radiance of seeing inside something seen. You change space by looking at it. I had said this before somewhere else, but it was still true. Space changed you by opening to the pressure. Opening to the pressure you introduced into the room, the hallway, the clearing. Space was something pressed, elapsing against something rising. I began to count colors. I counted something brown. I counted something gray. They were all neutral, disappearing colors. Some were sinking into the floor, some rising into the space above me, a space free of objects. Space was something free of objects, but hollowed in a waiting way. It was cut to a clearing and cut to a pulse. Pulse. It made an impression of folds when in fact it was a rising, pressing, not folding, silent, held suspended. Held suspended. Bended. Silent, held suspended. Space was an inelastic verticality disappearing into the clearing above me. There was something tall rising against something wide. It was an expanse elapsing within something dark and radiant, something breathing and slanted and fast. I hadn't quite known. encountered a long and very narrow opening cut through something impermeable, and something impermeable holding up something hollow. The whole thing was hollow until it was cut by something hanging, cut by something hanging, even though the hanging itself was hollow. Space was a series of hollows interrupted by something inelastic, something fast, darkening, something flat, something unknown and malleable. Space was something draping that enclosed its own radiance. It was something radiant cut to something glowing of a different tone, something deeper cut to the dark hollow, something orange. In this one moment, space was something orange cut through something malleable and hanging. It gave off a feeling. Space gave off a feeling that it itself was feeling something. The desire of cutting and being cut, the ambition of flowing, the awe of elapsing. Space was something holding, feeling, something elapsing and something dark, and it glowed, and it showed itself as that in a long and narrow way, in an open and clear way, in a vertically disappearing way. Eventually, I arrived at an intersection of my seeing, where I was looking out at space at the same time that I was making space by my looking, and I was being pulled into space by having a relationship to what was cut, what was flowing, such that I was also cut and flowing. Such that I was also cut and flowing. I was something cut inside something cut, and was a radiance of seeing inside something seen. You change space by looking at it. I had said this before somewhere else, but it was still true. And space changed you by opening to the pressure you introduced. Pressure you introduced into the room. Pressure you introduced into the room, the hallway, the clearing. Space was something pressed, elapsing against something rising. I began to count the colors. I counted something brown. I counted something gray. They were all neutral, disappearing colors. Some were sinking into the floor, some rising into the space above me, a space free of objects. Space was something free of objects, but hollowed in a waiting way. It was cut to a clearing, and cut to a clearing, to a clearing, and cut to a pulse. Cut to a pulse. It made an impression of folds when in fact it was a rising, pressing, not folding, silent, held suspended. Space was an inelastic verticality disappearing into the clearing above me. It was something tall rising against something wide. It was an expanse elapsing within something dark and radiant, something breathing and slanted and fast. Breathing and slanted and fast. Breathing and slanted, breathing and slanted, breathing and slanted and fast. Breathing and 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 slanted and fast.
Gorgeous.
We're going to end today's episode with a short reading. But before we do, I'd like to invite you to a live Zoom conversation immediately following the episode.
So I'm going to read 3 chapters from Unforgettable Across the Bridge. She is an architect, a former architect in Ravaka, who is now a writer. And I will just briefly say there is a crisis in Ravaka. It's very difficult for the Ravikians to describe what it is or to understand what it is, but it's a crisis that has made many people go away, and everyone else has felt that they had to actually stay at home, live these kind of separate lives, and sort of the only way in which they can meet is through writing. They meet together in this cafe and they write together. So this book is her sort of thinking through the books that she's written and these gatherings that happen. I wrote a book where the maps were jumping out of the page and I couldn't understand them, and they seemed to want to escape but wouldn't let go completely. This was going to be my book on Ravaka for the Times. The maps were pictures of our living, where we walked, where our monuments stood, where we met for coffee, our bookstores, the grid and blown out detail. The maps were phone numbers that no longer worked. They were addresses that fell off buildings. The maps were the names we called those walking away. Sirin Kuchek was a map because she translated for us. But the maps wouldn't stay in the book, so the book wouldn't close, and this was a problem. Yet I wanted the maps to represent the city, and to do this, they needed to be in motion the way all structures in Ravaka were. But this is not what you asked of maps, so perhaps I was calling the conveyance by the wrong name. Maps couldn't move and space couldn't move, yet within both the object world was alive and in a fidget. The book I was writing couldn't exist without these maps that separated streets from sentences, that showed awnings and paragraphs that always had a river. I wrote a book about a group of friends surviving a crisis, and then the book became my life. I named it once I realized this was happening, once I saw that I was writing on the previous day the script of the subsequent day in terms of who I saw and what I thought as I moved through the city. Once I saw this, I named the book and made it so that the life I was writing was also the life I had lived. It wouldn't just go one way. It wouldn't just be that I was writing what I had written. I had to live in order to write, and I had to meet my friends and receive their writing in order to write. And they needed to see me write in order to go on writing. And we all needed to sit in that cafe and wait out this crisis that was taking away all the other writers. And not just the writers, but also the bus drivers and Bellows students and the people who rode the trains and the audiences for our readings. I named the book that had become my life after the events of my life so that there would be no distinction. There was no distinction in my living. There was no break between days. You went to sleep, your body rested, but nothing changed. You woke into the same circling terrain of the city, the same buildings wandering and knocking into each other and knocking houses down, but nothing falling and no plaster coming off, just waddling and knocking and stumping buildings, looking all the time normal, but being absolutely unconventional in form. I wrote a book where after every sentence, I or my character or an object in the room disappeared. The book grew into 542 pages, which surprised everyone. A book where it was not right to add periods, where you couldn't partition with commas or ellipses, where you couldn't vanish by telling people you were vanishing. You dissolved, you cut, you cleaved. It was a book in which I recognized a companion text, one that would hold everything that this book was erasing. I would have to write this book as well, but not in this room, not on this hill. I felt I'd have to go somewhere new in order to see it, into a world that could hold the things I was missing. And Luswaj was missing, and everyone. The book I'd have to write would not take over the world as our current books did, but would just be a kind of archway, a beginning. I wrote a sentence and downtown was gone. The last building stood up and walked away, the fourth since that morning. I wrote a sentence to replace the building. Everything that vanished got replaced, at least in the book I was writing. But its space in the object world remained empty. A new object vanished. I was still writing. Buildings were like night creatures looking for an underground where they could meet other buildings and make relations beyond any that could be imagined by the human mind. They met in our blind sight, where we turned our heads to answer a question while we were bent in pride. They moved noiselessly across the city, leaving the story of their ambulations in our bodies, how we ached and searched for them. We never saw a building move, but were always picking ourselves up from the ground and could rarely find the place we were looking for on the day that we were looking for it. It was out there somewhere. And though we had become the story of their wandering, we had no way to engage them. How did you find out what was wrong? How did you say what you needed to say? It had to be more than description. You talked about buildings as if they were animals, but buildings were mostly numbers. Where angles met, the fluid dynamics of material, how the wind moved them but didn't knock them over. The Poussard was in Seat Barn instead of Centali, where it was built because of numbers desiring other numbers, patterns breaking, rethreading, otherwise. Thank you.